I am Sharon Weingarten, Chair of the programs for the Mental Health Task Force, which is a brand new pilot program. And Mary Bach, who's the head of the Mental Health Task Force, is literally on the road and forbidden by me to speak today. So I want to welcome Sally McQuillen, who has truly a story to tell. Sally is, I'm going to just give a very brief introduction so she has her full time to present, is a psychotherapist in private practice, specializing in addiction, grief, and trauma recovery. Sally is the author of a book called Reaching for Beautiful, which she will, I'm sure, tell us about. And I'm gonna stop there and let Sally tell her story.
Well, thank you, Sharon. Glad to be here and with all of you. And I wrote a memoir. It's called Reaching for Beautiful. And it says a memoir of loving and losing a wild child. It is the story of raising my firstborn, Christopher, and ultimately losing him. It is set in the first year and a half after he passed. And it is sort of an inside look at my grief experience and how I have survived that. And it's just come out into the world April 1st. And so it's been an exciting time to be able to share Christopher's spirit and speak to how to best heal and recover from grief, but also to how to help support anyone, a friend or family member who is grieving. And so, what I wanted to do to begin was, there are a lot of unique ways that we grieve, but there are some features of grief that we might expect to see. And so, if you have friends or family members, or if you yourself are grieving, here are a couple of things that you might expect to come up. One of them that is interesting to me is that people will often feel extremely guilty, as if they could have done something to save their loved one, especially if the loved one has died tragically by suicide, accident, which was the case with my son, overdose, illness, or before their time. When I speak to grief over the loss of a child in particular, it is generally traumatic. It happens out of time. Any loss that happens out of time unexpectedly means that there will be this layer of trauma. And so, for example, when we're feeling so powerless because someone was here and is suddenly gone, it's easier for us psychologically to blame ourselves, to be thinking about what we could have, would have, should have done, than it is to actually sort of live in the despair of what has occurred. For me, also inherently in losing a child, look, we don't necessarily, this isn't necessarily conscious, but we as parents think that our job is to keep our children alive and safe. And I spent a lot of time attempting to do that and then felt as if I'd failed when I couldn't. And that's a real obvious form of guilt that would be inevitable. But there are plenty of other sort of almost silly ways that we guilt ourselves. For example, when Christopher was deciding what he was going to do on the evening of January, that he'd he was home from college on his winter break, and he was trying to determine, New Year's Eve had just passed, and I was feeling pretty glad that he'd kind of been into the city and partying with friends and gotten home safely. And then he talked about whether he should go up to his friend's lake house or go back into the city and um, spend time with friends at the bars again. And I concluded that of those options, it certainly sounded like the safer option would be to just go where a whole bunch of boys were going to be hanging out in Wisconsin. And so I think I said, oh, I think that sounds like the preferable option. And so after he ended up dying along with three other young men who decided after drinking it would be a good idea to go into a canoe on a frozen lake, none of whom made it out alive, I, of course, relentlessly beat myself up over ever having made that suggestion, even though the truth is Christopher was going to do what he was going to do. And truth be told, I never had a whole lot of power and control over the choices he was making. Um, Grief also, if we're looking at things that we can expect to see in someone we're trying to support, it moves in waves. Now, acute grief is pretty pervasive. Initially, I was very much saturated with despair, but triggers can be anticipated over time. The anniversary of that person's death, their birthday. Um, there's certain things that you automatically know are going to bring forward more emotion. And then it might ebb, and there might also be, and in fact, there are inevitably a whole bunch of unanticipated triggers that you might not be prepared for, they're not prepared for. So, for example, it's been 9 years since Christopher passed, and doctor of mine who'd known I was writing for a long time, I had handed him my book once it was finished. He just read it and was telling me what a hell of a kid Christopher was. And there was something about the way he said it that evoked suddenly all of these tears. Here I was standing in the doctor's office, and I was in no way prepared because you tend to think I've got this, and they just I was flooded, and so much so that I had to kind of duck my head before I made my next appointment. But you know, grief is something that is a process, and it takes so much longer than we imagine it will to move through it and to um, I don't even know if the word recover is appropriate because in some ways, in my case, as a mother of a child who I have come to believe is here in spirit, there's still very much um, a missing of him in his beautiful body. And there's a very much and will be throughout the rest of my life, um, that will go on. Um, Grief has an extremely powerful physiological impact. So if you have a family member who's grieving, or a friend, or if you're grieving yourself, sometimes it's hard to appreciate what kind of attacks, what kind of a toll grief has on us physically. It will vary in severity, but it always impacts one's bandwidth. When you think about the fact that people can literally die from a broken heart, um, that sort of hits it home. Grief affects the brain, and we now have more scientific research to support the different ways that cortisol is firing. Um, a person, I know I felt my memory, of course, I was in shock for a long time, and I could appreciate that I was in shock because I just didn't have the same kind of word retrieval. I didn't feel as clear minded. I felt taxed, lethargic, sluggish. Um, and, when cortisol is pumping, we're inflamed and our immunity is suppressed. And I felt like my nervous system had been tripped. And that's pretty typical too, especially with traumatic loss. The nervous system gets hijacked and we don't feel safe. There's a loss of innocence. Bad things can happen. And so it was strange. I think sometime probably in the first year after Christopher died, I started to develop migraines. I'd never had a migraine in my life. I was having these aura like experiences where there were dots in front of my eyes. And I thought, is this because I am chronically crying? I never knew I possessed this many tears. And it just turns out that it was a result of the stress on my body. So if you're mindful of the fact that people aren't quite with it, um, that is, it's helpful because otherwise you might be really confused if you're asking someone about something and they're just not able to um, think straight. Um, the other thing, of course, that almost goes without saying is that grief has an incredibly powerful psychological impact. And everybody is different. Um, they might, for example, one of the things that was helpful for me and my husband was to appreciate the different ways that we were reacting to and we're equally fierce in our love for our firstborn. Excuse me, but he was angry at first, and I default much more easily into sadness. So he was angry, and there needed to be this sort of appreciation and understanding for the way that he needed to move through this. He wanted to always keep busy. I needed to retreat and get quiet. So, some of that is a part of supporting someone through this is to appreciate that grief doesn't always look the way we think it might. Some people are shutting down entirely, they're in complete denial. Other people, like I actually did, I'm a pretty generally outgoing person, and I became more socially anxious. I became afraid of what I was going to encounter in the world, whether I was going to be met with, um, all sorts of other people's reactions that I didn't know if I could handle because my own bandwidth was so compromised. And so having that kind of sense of what we might see, this variation, but which is inevitable, it helps us to be more comfortable with the subject of death, with the subject of grief, because guess what? Everybody here is going to die someday. And so I feel like I have a little bit of a mission to make the subject of death and grieving more comfortable so that my biggest sort of advocacy is that we can begin to approach rather than retreat from people who are grieving, because it's actually human instinct to want nothing to do with it. The fact that you were even here to listen to this subject matter suggests that you have personal or close proximity to the subject and have already become maybe more comfortable with it than some. But I remember there was a woman who lost her daughter, I think about maybe 4 years before I was became a bereaved mother. And I saw her at a Starbucks. She was in line. And I thought to myself, oh my gosh, first of all, how was she even standing? And then I thought, I don't want to approach her because I don't want to bother her. And I don't want, and I've heard other people say this. I don't think I was thinking this, but the sort of common human thought is, I don't want to remind someone of what they've lost without really appreciating that we will never forget it, that it is always a part of, it's sort of cellularly built into who we are. And so there's no, there need be no concern about reminding me of what I've lost. Um, so I remember steering clear of this gal, thinking I was doing her a favor. And it's funny too, because my husband would say, oh, I appreciate it when nobody really approaches me about this. For me, I felt so sensitive to walking into a grocery store and suddenly seeing on people's faces that immediate recognition of there's Sally. She's now a walking representation of my greatest fear. And I intellectually understood that that's who I had become and that you wouldn't necessarily want to approach me, but it did further alienate me. I felt more alone. And so I actually usually suggest that to help a grieving friend means to at least acknowledge their grief and, if possible, step in just even for a moment, however much you can tolerate, to put your hand on their shoulder if you see them, or to let them know that you're thinking of them in some way. That goes so far with me. Um, it's interesting because when we're grieving, we, in order to heal, need to feel connected. We need to feel connected to the person that we've lost, and we need to feel connected to other people because it's really excruciating to be in that space. And in order to survive it, in order to return to our lives, to being coming sort of returning back to the world, it's critical to be able to feel like other people can see us. And so I often think about um, trying to be empathetic rather than sympathetic. Brene Brown has this wonderful video. You might look it up. It distinguishes between empathy and sympathy. And it's animated in such a way as you see some animal way down at the base of a cave crying. And then you see his animal friend way up high, looking down, sort of pityingly, wow, it must be really awful to be down there in this complete darkness and devastation. And what we want to be able to encourage is come on down just for a little bit. Listen in, just listen. Um, be present. Recognize that there is absolutely no fixing this. And that's also something I appreciated when people were supporting me. I knew they'd have to pace themselves. I knew some people would be there immediately, come to the funeral, send the flowers, and um, and offer their condolences. And then for years later, the people who were mindful of the fact that I was still grieving were the people who were my true heroes. That even, I mean, it took me 7 years to feel like myself again. And so the other thing that I'd encourage is just for me anyway, if anyone ever asks me about Christopher or doesn't tire of my being able to maybe even repeat a story they might have heard before because it's all I've got, they are giving me an immense gift. I want to be able to preserve my bragging rights with my child who's no longer here, just as I do with my two living children. Please give me that gift. And so that is some of what I'm thinking about as ways to support a grieving friend, loved one, or yourself. Encourage them to be compassionate with themselves, be compassionate with them, praise them for getting out of bed in the morning, praise yourself if you're in that place, and see their vulnerability as a strength rather than a weakness. Don't let it scare you away. Grief is messy. Um, and make sure that you, if you're grieving, or your loved ones are adequately resourced, because it's too much for each of us to rely on any one resource. We need them all. I needed therapeutic support. I needed um, I needed, grief organizations. I needed to be sure I was going to all of my doctor's appointments so that I could maintain my physical health and stamina to take care of my other children. Um, all of these things, there's no one friend that can take it on entirely. We have to be sure that they're fully fueled and we're fully fueled if we're there to support them. So I hope that's been helpful. I wanted to be sure to give a little bit of time for any questions you might have. And thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Pardon me. Powerful, powerful presentation. I do not see Jillian, who is our tech expert on the screen. She might be there, but I am going to attempt to moderate if there are any questions or comments on what Sally had to share. And just raise your hand or speak out. John.
I wanted to say thank you. You're speaking of the deepest of bonds and traumatic loss, and you spoke so moving and so well. I'm sure we all resonate with you, and the grief goes on and on. I work with this, and for years with different kinds of loss in combat. What causes PTSD is the battle buddy. In the fire department, what causes PTSD is carrying out a child or carrying out your partner. And it's PTSD. It doesn't go away. It takes, just as you're saying, and the social network and the protective factors. We are social beings, and so you said it so well. And I just want to thank you.
Thank you, John.
Following up on what John just said, that I just jotted down, that use of the word fueled was so succinct, and it was nurturing. It was what you need.
There needs to be a permission slip that I have to say. I didn't ever give to myself as a therapist. I actually had preached so many things that I needed to put into better practice in my own life, starting with that self-compassion and gentleness. I'd been so hard on myself, thought I had to pull myself up by the bootstraps and do grief gracefully. And there just wasn't that, I didn't have the capacity to be strong in the traditional sense. And so, yes, and then the PTSD that you spoke to, how that compounds the loss process. And there's so many layers that we need to move through. I didn't mention, I just had wanted to say, the guilt can keep us stuck far longer. So the need to forgive ourselves and reconcile some of those things to be able to make peace is an imperative way to find some lightness, to actually give ourselves permission to feel some joy, because I know Christopher wants me to, still be here. He wants me to have a life that has joy in it. And initially, I remember feeling like it would be disloyal to him, that might suggest I wasn't honoring him as fully as I do. And actually, I think we better honor the people who've gone by living our best lives. I try to embody my son's spirit.
I had, this is just a recent social event. I attended a gathering, and a woman had shared the loss of her son. He was also 21, and he died of cancer. And mom had just had the same just received the same diagnosis, and had shared this was her first outing. She was feeling fine. And was going through this through various levels of what you're describing. And she made me think of something. She said, I'd like to write a book about what not to say. And I
Yes.
said, tell me. And she said, if I ever heard another person say he is in a better place, she said, I'd like to write a book of what not to say, and how much better if they just showed up or even didn't show up.
There is that. And, I did even consciously appreciate at the time that there's no right thing to say, but there's certainly some things that I might be inclined to discourage saying. We can't quite, you know, we, I remember even someone coming up to us early and talking about how they felt when they lost their cat. And for them, this was, and I had to remember that the greatest loss you've ever experienced is your own, like it's not. So for her, this was equivalent, and there isn't any ranking system, but at the time it felt more alienating. It's really easy to say something that, sort of speaking to the importance of connecting, that can make us feel distanced from someone else. And that's where that sort of pity versus empathy comes in, the sort of, oh, I just can't imagine what that would be like. And I remember getting a little frustrated by that and thinking, you know what? Do me a favor and attempt to imagine it just for a minute, because you don't have to live through it. If I can live through this, if I can endure it, you can take a moment and be even uncomfortable just thinking about what I must be experiencing. That would be amazing.
Mm.
And people do, you know, and some people can, and some people cannot. You know,
I do have a question, if I might. And Sharon, I just want you to know I'm not driving right now.
Good, Mary. Okay, then you can ask your questions.
So, very powerful presentation. I have some friends who have just experienced this kind of loss, and they said, "Can we record this? Are we recorded this? We're going to be traveling. We cannot attend." So, I'm so happy that you were able to share this. But I have a question about your other children, and
yeah.
how did you help them manage the grief, or were there other resources? That had to have been, you mentioned your husband, so I'm just wondering about your children, the other children.
Yes, I often intentionally will, not surprisingly, be protective of their experiences, but of course, each of my living children were devastated and responded, you know, when I talked about the various ways that, you know, my daughter is a little bit more like my husband. She was angry. My son is a little bit more like I am, and he shut down. He shut down. And it was excruciating on top of, you know, my own grief to watch them grieving and also, again, be fairly powerless over it. I knew I did not have the bandwidth. And so, what I needed to do was make sure they were resourced, but also respect the fact that people respond to those resources. You know, I had a 16-year-old boy who wasn't going to be particularly responsive to suddenly seeing a therapist, even though he was shut down. So, yes, we all kind of needed to be so loving and kind, you know, give a lot of grace to one another and attempt to. One thing I was really conscious of, Mary, was I was not going to let my own grief, to the extent that I was able, interfere with my availability to my children. I was going to be very present for them, again, to the extent that I was able. And I was never going to go to them with my grief. They might have seen me cry, but I was going to force myself to show up. I mean, my youngest and I were at a lacrosse tournament when I could barely see straight. I think within a week, I was at his school talking to the administration to see what they might want to do, you know, in the way of resources. Um, so, yeah, it's a tough one. You just do the best you can.
Before we conclude, and if we're recording and people have additional questions, I encourage you to go ahead and let us just run on after our announced 30 minutes. But one thing I do want to definitely slip in is your book. What's the easiest? You don't have and you don't have to deal with your computer now and share your screen and so forth. I'm in a couple of book clubs, and I often just write down on a Post-it note what's the name of the next book. And it's so lovely to just be able to go to, in my case, Audible or Amazon or wherever,
Yes,
and just type in the name of the author to recall what was that book so I can easily purchase it. Can I do that on Audible or Amazon with your book?
absolutely. If you go to Amazon or essentially anywhere where books are sold and look up Reaching for Beautiful or my name, Sally McQuillen, you could actually go to my website, www.sallymcquillen with an E and .com, and you could order my book from there. Or I'd really be grateful for if there are book clubs that may be of interest, may be
Oh.
interested, or for anyone who you think may need a presentation like this, I'm happy to spread these messages.
Very interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you. Do we have any further comments or questions? Or are we going to follow the rules and end just about on time? We're a few minutes late.
I'll add a comment and try to make it quick. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Yeah. I am a deacon at our parish, and we have put together a bereavement, and a grief support group. And we call it Companions in Grief. And I was really glad that somebody suggested that title. But what I've learned from Sally and realize with our group is that your relationship with the person that you are in a position to interact with is not that important. It doesn't have to get in the way of how you step into, as Sally said, their grief. You could be meeting this person for the first time. You could be someone who's an acquaintance. You could be someone who's close to their spouse, but you really don't know them. No, it doesn't matter if you're given the opportunity to, and sometimes you have to take a step to realize that opportunity. Your ability to communicate that you're stepping into it, and that's critical. That's hard. It's not always easy
No.
to do it the right way, but that person needs you, and they value that as much as they value their first friend, that they have from the little backyard swimming pool, and how that person is supporting them. So thank you, Sally.
You bet, Jack. So true. I will say there were people that were strangers to me that showed up because this was a pretty public tragedy. And I can't tell you how surprised I was, but how touched because of the very thing you mentioned, being seen in my pain. And then over time, the people who could appreciate that even though I might present a particular way or look like I'm fine or seem fine, that there is sadness in my heart, and be able to see that's that connection that is such a healing balm.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, very good.
I think you couldn't have ended on a more appropriate note. Thank you, Sally. Thank you for sharing your story and helping someone who is not on this call, who might read your book or might view this video. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you again,
Thank you.
Sharon, and thanks to all of you for listening.
You're welcome.
Very helpful.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.